While the Soviets were placing nukes in Cuba and the CFP, Atlantis was fighting a war for independence. However, they had to fight both the British and the Portuguese as they both owned land in Atlantis. By 1963, all of Atlantis was liberated. In 1965, another independence movement was taking place. Rebels in northern Africa were rebelling from the British rule there. They called their nation Lionland, after the ancient Lionist Empire. They were quickly able to get independence, so the war ended in about a month. After independence, they gave Italy Tripoli and the surrounding area as an act of peace. Now, you might be wondering what NATO did to retaliate in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, they added Sweden and Finland to NATO, and stationed nukes across NATO countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Germany, and Italy. This caused the Soviets to agree to remove their nukes from the CFP in Cuba, ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. NATO removed their nukes from Europe as well. In 1965, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War started. North Vietnam quickly swept through South Vietnam, and with support from the USSR and North China, it didn't look good for South Vietnam. However, by the time North Vietnam had reached the outskirts of Singapore, the last major city, reinforcements from the USA, Canada, and other NATO countries arrived. This empowered South Vietnam to push North Vietnam back. This turned the tide of the war and allowed South Vietnam to win. The war ended in 1967 and the peace treaty united the Vietnams into a democratic country called Siam. However, they used the South Vietnam flag. After the Vietnam War, capitalist/democratic countries in Asia wanted to make their own NATO, so they did. It was called PTO, or Pacific Treaty Organization. It included Japan, South Korea, South China, Siam, Australia, Burnland, New Zealand, and the USA. Let's rewind to 1959. In 1959, the USSR launched the first satellite into space. It was called Sputnik. This started the space race. The USSR seemed to be winning because in 1961, they sent a person into space. However, the USA wanted to beat the USSR in the space race, so they attempted to put a man on the moon. This was the Apollo mission. It took until Apollo 11 in 1969 to do it, but the USA won the space race. In 1970, in the British part of the Middle East, rebels formed in Dubai. They called themselves Arabia, and began to take over the British part of the Middle East. The British decided to just give them what they wanted, as they could afford to lose their Middle Eastern lands as they could still get oil from their African lands. Arabia decided to build some new cities like Abu Dhabi. In 1971, Arabia declared war on Persia. They took the land they wanted, Baghdad and pretty much all land surrounding it in a few days, ending the war. After the war, Persia renamed itself to Iran. In 1972, Austria-Hungary collapsed into three pieces. Austria, in the west, Hungary in the east, and Lalandia in the northwest. Hungary was forced to become communist by the USSR and joined the Warsaw Pact. So was Lalandia. Not wanting to collapse and be divided like Austria-Hungary, the Byzantine Empire joined NATO and switched to a constitutional monarchy in 1973. In 1974 AC, the Socialist Council of Bolivar collapsed. It collapsed into many countries like Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Hernandez, which Brazil annexed, and Colombia, which took over Ecuador. In 1979, the first video game console, the Atari, was invented. The first game on there was Pong. Before that, in 1972, video games did exist, but they were on arcade machines which you could not use in your home. Other consoles were created too, like the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1983 and the Sega Genesis in 1989. There were even portable consoles like the Nintendo Game Boy released in 1989 and the Sega Game Gear released in 1990. In 1988, the Warsaw Pact started to dissolve. Countries started leaving and they also started becoming democracies. Some didn't, like Yugoslavia. There was also a communist nation that stopped being communist but didn't become democratic. That was Pan Am. After the Warsaw Pact dissolved, Pan Am became a dictatorship instead and divided their land into 13 districts and a capital. Another thing that happened because of the Warsaw Pact's dissolution is South China uniting with North China. Because of all this happening, the USSR itself collapsed. The countries that got independence from the Soviets, in order, were Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Eagle King, Russia, and the last country that left was Kazakhstan. Now that the USSR was gone, more countries joined NATO. Poland, Prussia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all joined. And after reuniting with Hungary, Austria-Hungary joined too. After the USSR collapsed, the Cold War was over, with a clear USA/NATO victory. But tensions aren't over yet, because some countries still oppose the USA, like Yugoslavia, Belarus, North Korea, and Russia. By the way, in 1991, after the Soviet collapse, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System released.